The last few weeks we've been in the book of Matthew. The book of Matthew in your Bibles in the seat pocket in front of you. We're going to be turning this morning to Matthew chapter 9. Matthew chapter 9, and it's on page 583 in the Bible in the seat pocket in front of you. We've looked at different sections in Matthew. We looked at Matthew chapter 5 2 weeks ago. Last week, Matthew chapter 28. And we asked the question, who has God called us to be, and what has God asked us to do? And so as we read our section this morning, the question we're pondering is, why has God called us to do this? Matthew chapter 9, verse 35, and we'll read up until the end of verse 38. Jesus traveled through all the towns and villages of the area, teaching in the synagogue and announcing the good news about the kingdom. And he healed every kind of disease and illness. Now, the writer of Matthew is the apostle Matthew, one of the disciples of Jesus. And here he just gives, sort of near the center or near the beginning of the gospel, he gives just a little snippet of Jesus' life and ministry. And that is what we've just read there. Then he carries on in verse 36. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were confused and helpless, like a sheep without a shepherd. He said to his disciples, "The harvest is great, but the workers are few. So pray to the Lord who is in charge of the harvest. Ask him to send more workers into the field." As we read those words and we look at them, who do you think Jesus is talking to when he says we need more workers? Who do we identify as those workers? Any guesses? Okay, Jesus is talking to us. Jesus is talking to his followers. We, as followers of Christ, as Christians, as we call ourselves, we recognize and understand that when we read these words, Jesus is talking to us when he says he needs more workers. But the one thing that I want us to evaluate and isn't always clear to us is, what is our motivation? Why is it that God has called us? What is his motivation, and what is our motivation in going and working for God, or following out his call, his command to make disciples? And I'm not sure how many of us often pause and evaluate why we do what we do. This is a really interesting topic in human science and human understanding. Many people have looked at it and wonder what motivates, what leads people to do what they do. Now, if you grew up in the church at all, or you were around the church at any time in your life, you might have heard and you might have come across or experienced different reasons why we are called, or different motivations for doing what we do. For example, I know myself, I can only talk of those that I've heard, and I'm sure many of you will identify with some of these. Many times, teachers or preachers, in trying to instill in us or give us the motivation to go and follow and do what God has called us to do, many times they often use fear. Have any of you ever experienced this before? Motivating by fear. And often it's the fear of judgment, or the fear of punishment, the fear that if you don't do what God has asked you to do, he will punish you for not doing that. That is often a motivator. One question, parents might identify with this sometimes with their children. Is fear sometimes a good motivator? Okay. Sometimes it can get children to do what you want them to do. And so teachers and preachers have adopted this as well and added that as a motivator for trying to get us to do what God has called us to do. Another one that is often commonly used is reward. Now, a lot of us might identify with this one. How many of you heard and grew up hearing that you would get stars in your crown? Stars for every person that you won to the gospel of Christ. Yes? Okay, and I grew up thinking and believing that, and you could see that picture, the crown and it's the stars glistening, the promise of reward, motivating people by reward. Then there's another one, guilt. You're a bad Christian if you don't go and do this. Guilt. It's one that often many of us experience and feel. And then if you've grown up in our context as an Adventist church, then one you might have come across as well is the end of time. Motivating with the whole idea that, now the basis for this comes out of Matthew chapter 24, verse 14. And there's a verse there that goes like this. It says, the gospel of the kingdom, many of us know it, the gospel of the kingdom will be preached to all the world as a witness to all nations, and then the end will come. And we have gone and done something very interesting. We've gone and said, okay, that is a true statement that Jesus made, and we agree with that, and yes, it's great. But then we've gone and said, okay, so because when the gospel goes to all the world, the end will come. If I want the end to come sooner for me, why? Because I want to go to heaven and get off this earth, then I'll just go about and preach the gospel and share the gospel so that the end can come sooner. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad motivation. This isn't necessarily the idea that we want Jesus to come is not a bad thing. And I believe it's a true thing and it's a true reality that we're looking forward to. But when our motivation for interacting and engaging with people and discipling people is so that we can leave this world and have our reward in heaven, then what ultimately is behind that motivation? Is it selfish? Okay, so this has often been one of the motivations used in church as well. And then another one is peer pressure. I clearly remember, when you look around and you realize, hey, everyone in the group that I associate with, everyone around me, they seem to be doing this. So maybe I should be doing this as well. It's a common thing for us as humans to be influenced and directed by our peers, those around us. One classic one, I remember a teacher told us the one time, they said, you know what? It will be really embarrassing if you get to heaven and you see everyone else has 40 stars in their crown and you only have one. And so they were trying to use this peer pressure to motivate you to do and work for God. And I just, in my weird mind, I picture, you can imagine, keeping up with the Grahams. Billy Graham has won so many people, this heavenly sitcom, the keeping up with the Grahams. Is that what it's about? Is that why God has called us to make disciples? Another one, and this is one that many of us can identify with as well, is authority, respect for authority. For many of us here, it will be good enough that Jesus said it, I will do it. And that's great. For the disciples, it seemed to be good enough. Remember last week we looked at when Jesus gave the commission to the disciples, he approached them, and what did he start off with? Do you remember? He started off by saying, all authority in heaven and earth has been given unto me. Therefore, go. And was that good enough for the disciples? It surely was, because the good news and the gospel of Jesus has spread around the world. But I want us to not miss something here. The disciples, that was good enough for them because they had walked through life with Jesus. They had journeyed with Jesus. They understood and knew what motivated and moved him. They had witnessed what he did. They had heard what he said, and they trusted in who Jesus was. And so when he gave them the command, they were willing to go and do it. And for many of us, that motivation will be the same, and it will be enough, and it will be great. Based on psychology, there are a number of things that drive us as human beings. There are a number of things that cause us to do what we do. One of the most common, studies on this has been, many of you might have heard of, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. He identifies that there are base needs that all of us human beings naturally and instinctively seek to fulfill. And this is what drives and moves us to do anything in life. And so at the bottom level there, he starts off with physiological needs, the need to drink water, the need to eat food, the need to, I can't remember all of those that he mentions in there, but the need to exercise, whatever it is, these needs drive what we do and motivate us to do what we do. And this is the base level. He says if these aren't fulfilled, if these aren't satisfied, then we won't be able to climb up the rest of that pyramid completely. Then he also says safety, self-preservation, the need to have shelter and have a home and protect our family, protect our loved ones, the safety, the need to also protect ourselves from harm. That's what drives us to do what we do. Then he also talks about love and belonging, the need for community and for friendship. That is what sometimes drives and motivates. And eventually he gets esteem, the need for self-esteem, for confidence, for achievement, respect of others, and respect by others. That is what often drives. And then finally, the last one, the top of the pyramid, self-actualization. When we finally become who we have desired and destined to be, that is when we finally arrive at, and when our motivation is driven by that self-actualization, that is the place that we need to try and be. But what have you noticed by all of these base needs and drivers in that they have identified? Have you noticed anything? What is ultimately behind all of them? Did anyone pick it up? Self. Thank you. Self. Ultimately, what they're identifying, and this is what psychologists are saying, when we take that kind of viewpoint, self and the preservation or the fulfillment of self is what drives everything we do. And can you see how this kind of thinking, by the things we mentioned above, has crept in to motivations that we often try and use to encourage people to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ? But you and I know from experience. So if you want to be driven by self, then the list we mentioned before, that, the fear, the reward, the guilt, the end is coming, the peer pressure, the keeping up with the Grahams, then that is fine. If you want to be driven by self, then those things would seem to be okay. But each and every one of us knows by our own experience that motivators, that fear, reward, guilt, and all of these, they are temporary. They never last. They never endure. And so often then we sit and wonder, why is it that we aren't going? Why isn't the church going and carrying out the command that Jesus gave? Why aren't we seeing the disciples flooding into the church like Jesus mentioned and promised would happen? Because you see, we all instinctively know from our experiences that fear, if we're using fear as a motivator, fear ultimately paralyzes and clouds our judgment. Focusing on reward feeds our own selfish desires. Focusing on guilt leaves us weak and defeated. Focusing on the end makes us miss out on, and driven by self-preservation, it makes us miss out on the now as well. And peer pressure keeps us comparing and looking at ourselves in trying to find satisfaction and meaning. And focusing on respect means we miss out on the joy of really loving because we're caught up in obligation. But the question I want to ask this morning is, if Jesus is the one that we are really following, then the question that I want to address is, what is it? What motivated Jesus to do what he did? What moved Jesus to act when he did? Because if he is the one we are following, then I believe what moved him will move us as well. So let us go back to our verse in John chapter 9, verse 35 and 36, and we'll read it there again. It says, Jesus traveled through all the towns and villages of the area, teaching in the synagogues and announcing the good news about the kingdom of God. And he healed every kind of disease and illness. Then he saw the crowds. He had compassion on them because they were confused and helpless, like a sheep without a shepherd. When Jesus looked out at the crowds, the Bible tells us what is the first thing that happened? He saw. He saw, and what did he see? He saw their need. When Jesus saw the crowds, he looked and he noticed and he saw people. He saw people that were in desperate need of what only he could give. You know, often I find, and I'm talking about myself here, we are so self-absorbed in what is happening in our own lives that I've often sometimes been spent walking, for whatever reason, been walking through a mall for about an hour, and I stop and I catch myself and I realized that whole hour I haven't really even noticed any other person, yet the mall is full of people. And sometimes I pause and I stop and I sit down and I just, okay, this might sound creepy, but I just sit and watch people. How many of you do that? Come on. Okay. Sometimes I'll just pause and sit and watch people. And it's amazing when you take the time, what it is you can notice, what it is you can observe, what it is you can see when you just look at the people walking by. And even sometimes I try and imagine, what is their story? What is their life all about? There's so many people that so often we are just disengaged from because we are so self-absorbed in our own reality and what is happening in our everyday lives. But Jesus saw the crowd. He noticed the people, and he did not see just potential buyers or potential lovers or potential opponents or potential converts. He did not look at people for what they could profit him. Instead, he saw people for who they were, sons and daughters of God, all in need and yearning for meaning, purpose, community, direction in this life. When we look around us, what do we see? Who is the crowd for you? Who is the crowd for me? There's a short video that I watched one time on YouTube. You know when your friends paste something on Facebook or they send something in your email and it's a nice little video, and I watched it. And it was a simple homemade video, but it stirred something in me, and it touches on this idea really well, where this guy, he was kind of doing his everyday thing where he'd go to work. He'd start off in the morning, reverse out of his garage. There would be a young boy riding his bike right behind his car, like every morning. And he'd like, stop. And like, that guy is behind there every morning. Why can't he just, I need to tell his parents this kid is just, he's off the leash. And then he'd go to work, and then he'd get to a stop street. And there's always something, it takes him time to try to get into the road because the road is so busy, and he's getting frustrated and irritated, and a guy pulls in front of him, and he's like, whatever, I can't believe, why did that guy pull in front of me? He gets to the coffee store, and as he's about to take his park, this lady just comes in and parks in front of him, and he's like, what? Thanks, okay, great, and says some kind words to the lady, and as he walks past her car on the way to the coffee shop, he's like, what? Then he gets into the coffee shop, and sure enough, there's a long queue, and he's getting frustrated by the person in front of him who's just placing this huge long order and taking so much time. Then the attendant behind the counter is, he pays his order, and the attendant is like, please, sir, if you don't mind being patient because there's a long queue and we have to take our time. And he's getting frustrated with the guy behind the counter. Eventually, he's just sitting in his chair waiting for his order when a huge man out of nowhere just stands in front of him and gives him a set of glasses. He takes these glasses, the guy disappears then. Okay, it's kind of corny, but it's supposed to be like a, woo moment. And he puts these glasses on, and as he looks with these glasses, suddenly, everyone around the room, the glasses reads their story. And the whole idea is, you're putting on the eyes of Jesus. And he looks at that lady who had pulled in front of him and taken his park, and there it reads, grieving the loss of her only child. Then he looks at the guy who's busy approaching him with his coffee and struggles with addiction. Then he looks at the other man who pushed in front of the line and just wanted to go and buy a little something, and he's sitting there with his child, and it reads, just lost his job, used his last bit of money to spend with his boy. Then, of course, as he's driving home, he's trying to get all these thoughts and all these things out of his head. Then he gets back to the street, and that little boy is riding his bike. Dad left home. Mom, stuck in addiction, has no one to care for him. Puts a little bit of a different slant on what it is we often see and experience in our lives. If we were to look with the eyes of Christ and look and actually see and notice, what would we see? What would we notice? You know, just around us here in New Zealand, in our city, in Manukau, I looked up Statistics New Zealand, where they gave sort of the population demographics breakdown of who we are. And did you know that just around us, 40% of the people that live in our community have not heard and don't know Christ? They haven't experienced and gotten to know the good news of the gospel. 40% of people around us. Another interesting stat was that the area around us is the most deprived area, and I'm sure many of us didn't need to look up Stats New Zealand to know this, but the most deprived area in our city, possibly some of the areas even in our country. And they have what they call a deprivation index, where 1 is the least deprived and 10 is the most deprived. And the least deprived is represented in green, and the most deprived is represented in red. And if you can see on the board there, I've circled where we are. We right smack bang in the center, and there's red all around us. Do we notice? Do we see? Another interesting fact that I discovered is that they estimate about 20,000 children around us in our community will go to school every morning without having had a decent meal. Do we notice? Do we see? 1 in 4 suffer from depression. The list goes on and on. You can look around, and when we see so many people around us, when we look at them, they look self-assured, they look confident, they look as though, you know, they don't want to hear what we have to share, or they don't want to experience what we know. But if we looked with the eyes of Christ, what would we actually see? Jesus carries on. And the verse, it says, he saw the crowds, then he had compassion on them. Jesus saw the crowd and was moved, motivated, driven by compassion. The Greek word used here, when it is literally translated, it means, and I need to get this right, a stirring of the bowels. This word compassion is a stirring of the bowels, deep inside your stomach. In essence, what he is saying, when Christ looked at the crowd, he got that gut-wrenching feeling. Okay, I can see a few people laughing, stirring of the bowels. I know it. Does it? Okay, stirring of the bowels. That gut-wrenching feeling when he noticed and saw the need in the crowd that he was witnessing. See, compassion implies a deep-seated emotional unsettling. Compassion is not merely a thought concept. It is not merely thinking, I have an obligation to help that person. Compassion is a deep feeling that is aroused when we see someone crying, when we see someone hungry, when we see someone sick, or when we see someone hurting, and it stirs up inside of us something that moves and drives and motivates us to act on that person's behalf. Another powerful thing about compassion as a motivator is that it calls all our basic instinctive needs, it calls all of them into question and puts them in their rightful place. And what I mean by this is why compassion motivates us to action in situations that our minds would tell us to avoid. Do you remember what Maslow said? Self-preservation. Our Our physiological needs are often what determine and direct what we do. But when you're moved by compassion, you sometimes do things that otherwise would make no sense. For example, if I was not moved by compassion one night when I was driving down a road in a slum area in South Africa in 2010, and I noticed a guy on the corner who was asking for help, if it was not motivated or moved by compassion or by the love of God or by the Spirit's prompting in my heart, there is no way that I should have stopped next to that road to help that man, because there was a real fear and a real danger of being hijacked and my life being at risk. Another reason is compassion tells us to persevere when our minds would tell us to give up. This is why the man, when he was lying on the wing of a crashed airplane in the middle of a frozen river a few years ago, this was shown on the news, it was observed by people all around the world, that this man, he was there in the river with a whole number of other people on this wing of the plane. And time again, as the lifesaver hung down by the helicopter was thrown out at the man, every time he would swim out into the freezing cold water where no one else wanted to go. He would swim out and persevere through the blinding fuel that was being whipped up by the rotors of the helicopter, grab that lifesaver and bring it back and hand it to the next person that was holding on to the wing. Time and time again this happened. People couldn't understand it. Why didn't he just grab it and get out of there and get help? Self-preservation should have been his overriding motivator at that time, but compelled and directed by compassion. He did not care for his own self. And it even cost him his life, because when the helicopter went back the final time, the man was no longer on the wing of the airplane. He had drowned. But time and time again, against all reason, he went back, motivated by compassion. Compassion will move us to help someone even when our own finances will be adversely affected. And this is why Jesus was moved and motivated by compassion. It's more than an intellectual understanding. It's a deep emotional unsettling derived from the love of God for hurting people. This is where it comes from. It doesn't come naturally for us as human beings. If we look at it from the natural point of view, then we'll agree with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Naturally, yes, we want to preserve self. Naturally, yes, it's all about what I can get and what I need. But when we're in tune and directed by the love of God, compassion motivates and compels us to acts of service. And you see, I believe this is something that is missing in our world today. This is something that we desperately need to see. And I don't know if any of you, one of the greatest examples of this was something that I saw just a few months ago on the news. I don't know how many of you heard of the story of that little 2-year-old Chinese boy that was run over by a vehicle in a busy marketplace. If you want to be deeply disturbed, you can go look it up on the YouTube. Because the market CCTV caught everything that happened. The little child got separated from his parents and ran out into the street. A utility vehicle that was coming down the road rode over the child. Actually rode over the child, stopped, looked, and then carried on going. 15 people, they counted, walked past, saw the child, but carried on moving. Even another vehicle came and rode over the child again and carried on going. Where is our compassion? Until eventually one old store lady coming out to gather and sweep out the front of her store noticed the child, went over and picked the child up, and at that same time on the CCTV you see the mother coming and running to look for her child, and she brings the child to the mother. Later it was reported on the news that the child died But it took about 10 minutes and 15 people to walk past, see the child, and carry on going. This is why I believe having the love of Christ and the compassion for hurting people is so important for us in our world today. And what I believe is going to be the only motivator that will truly see this mission of God fulfilled and this mission of God go and impact this world. Because when people see the love and the compassion that can only come from God, that will be more evidence than anything we could ever say. If we know God, if we know how to be with Him, like we talked about a couple of weeks ago, we start to notice things. We start to notice people. We start to see. And we begin to have inexplicable feelings of compassion deep within our stomach for others that are hurting. This compels us. This is what drives our mission. In verse 37, Jesus continues. He said to His disciples, "The harvest is great, but the workers are few." The harvest is great, but the workers are few. I want us to note, He didn't say there's a whole lot of work to do, although we know there is. He didn't say, look at all the fields that need planting. He didn't say, look at the billions of seed here that we need to go out and let's get moving. He said, the harvest is great. There is already a harvest. But the workers to bring in the harvest are few. He focused on the harvest. Now, you and I know that before there's a harvest, there's a season of planting. There's a watering, there's a working, there's a toiling, there's a preparing, there's a stressing about the method of farming, the fixing of all the equipment and everything that goes along with that, the best strategy or whatever it may be. Or at least that's what we seem to keep doing. But Jesus is saying, look at the harvest. It is great. It is plentiful. Look around you. The crowd is already gathered. This world knows that it has a need. This world knows that there is something wrong. People are ready and wanting to experience the love and the grace of God. And then he ends in verse 38 and he says, so pray to the Lord who is in charge of the harvest. Ask Him to send more workers into the field. You see, our God who rescues desperately wants us to celebrate the harvest. So He asked us to pray to the Lord who is in charge of the harvest and is already working by His Spirit in the lives of the people. Do you want more workers? Do you know what more workers means for us? It is not just in order to get the job done. It's not more people knowing Jesus, even though that's great, and people being rescued by Him. It is not just seeing people around them, but it is seeing people moved with compassion. Then jumping in and celebrating the harvest. More workers in a hope-filled, church-filled, Spirit-filled work. More works means more saved. And so this morning, I want us to take up this challenge that Jesus gave. When He spoke to His disciples there and He said, look at the harvest. Look at the crowds around you. Each and every one of us, I want us to pause for a moment and let's acknowledge the crowd. Who is it that you bump into on your way to work? Who is it that you see every day when you stop at the petrol station? Who is it that you rub shoulders with when you're in the grocery store? Who is it that is living right next door and you might not even know yet? Let us acknowledge the crowd, but then I want us to take some time now to pray. Because my desire, and I believe God's desire for this church, is that this church will be a sending church. That we will go from here into our communities, into our city, and impact all of them with the love and the grace of God, motivated and compelled by our compassion for hurting people. And so I want to take some time now to just pause and pray as we ask God for workers. Let's bow our heads. Lord, you instructed your disciples there when you were telling them this, that we need to pray. We need to acknowledge our dependence on you in this task. We need to acknowledge that you are the one who does the work. Lord, sometimes we get so caught up in it and we think that we are the ones who need to convince or convict people of who you are. But Lord, you have said, no. Your Spirit is already working on the hearts and minds of people. What you need and what you desire is followers of you that are willing to go out, get alongside people, and then help people understand just who it is you are. They already know their need. They already sense their need. And so, Lord, I pray that you will send workers from this church, that you'll inspire each and every one of us in this church to go into the harvest. Lord, help us to see where the harvest is already ripe. Help us to know what it is we need to show or say or communicate to people. Because, Lord, we know that they are desperately wanting to experience your love and your grace. So, Lord, we pray that you will send workers. Send them from our midst. And as you do, Lord, that more and more people will then be able to go and meet their friends and tell their friends and share with their colleagues and share with others just like them. Because, Lord, as we do this and as we are directed and motivated by your love, we know that your mission will be successful. So this is our prayer, Lord. Please send us workers, and it's all motivated and directed by your love and your desire to rescue more and more people. Amen.